No matter what programming language you work with, one of the most fundamental building blocks are variables. A variable allows you to store information and then access that information throughout your application. Before we create our first variable, let's go ahead and organize our file system a little bit to keep things organized as I add more demos. First, we'll create a source folder, and then we'll move both of our existing demos into that source folder. And then inside our source folder, we'll also create a file to demo variables. We'll call it o1 variables.ts. To create a variable, we'll use the let keyword, and then we'll create a variable where we can give it any name we want. For now, I'll just call it my variable, and I'll give it some value. So in the variable, let is the keyword used to define that we're creating a variable. My variable is the name of the variable. This name could be whatever we want, but the name should be descriptive based on what you're storing. So if we were storing a first name, the variable could be first name. If we were storing a color, the variable could be color. The more descriptive you can be with the name, the better, as that helps you understand your code if you come back and reread it later. And then we use the equal symbol, and we assign a value to that variable. If I hover over my variable, you'll notice that says let my variable : string. Where it says : string is defining the data type for that variable. Now TypeScript is very good about inferring type. So if I instead change this to a number, then we see that TypeScript has inferred that the variable is holding a number. I quite commonly allow TypeScript to infer the type for me. However, this does get me into trouble in certain scenarios. So often this is what I will do, but often it's better to actually be explicit with your type and specify whether you're storing a string, a number, or some other data type, which we'll get into in future lessons. To do this, I'll say : string, signify that I want to store a string in this variable. Now when we do that, TypeScript is giving me an error message saying type number is not assignable to string, as 0 is a number, and I've specified that my variable should only store strings. So I'll fix this, I'll correct it back to some value, and now we're good to go again. Now I'll log it to the console and verify that our application is working and show that this variable is storing the data that we've assigned to it. Now as I'm typing out console log, if I start typing the variable name, VS Code should have some IntelliSense and start giving me suggestions. In this case, it's showing a suggestion of my variable, and usually I won't fully type things out. I'll wait till it gives me a suggestion that's correct, and then I'll either select it with the mouse, or in this case, I can just hit enter, and it will autofill for me. This is going to be much faster than always typing every single thing out and risking typos and then having to fix those typos and having all sorts of issues because of it. And then to run this file, once again, we're going to say npx tsnode. And then here I'll also start typing source. I'll hit tab, and my computer will autofill the rest. And then I'll start typing the demo, o1. I'll hit tab. My computer will autofill the rest out. I'll hit enter and run my demo. We can see our console that some value was printed, and that's because we printed the variable, but stored inside of the value was the string some value. Now our code is going to run line by line from top to bottom. So later in our code, maybe we want to update the variable to be hello world. This is another part where the type comes into play. Because this is a string, if I instead try to assign it the number 5, it won't work, as my variable is set to type string, and therefore it can't hold numbers. So put it back to hello world, we'll log my variable, we'll rerun the code, and this time, as the code's running, the first time we get a console log statement, it prints some value. Then we reassign my variable to be hello world, and now when we console log my variable, this time it prints hello world to the console. Something else I want to mention is that variable names will follow something known as camel case. In camel case, you'll always start with a lowercase letter, and then rather than using spaces between words, we'll start subsequent words with a capital letter. So the next way we can create a variable is with the const keyword, and this time I'll say const first name equals, and my name is Blake. As I will typically do, I'll console log my variable, I'll run my code, and this time it printed Blake as the last log statement as I logged the variable first name, which stores the string Blake. When I went to run my code, you might have noticed I wasn't typing the whole thing out. If you hit up arrow, it will actually autofill the previous command you run. So I'm simply just hitting the up arrow on my keyboard and then enter, and it just reruns the previous command for me. So you might be wondering, what is the difference between using the let keyword and the const keyword when creating a variable? Well, when using the const keyword, we actually aren't allowed to reassign our variable. So here I went ahead and I tried to reassign first name to be another string. And in this case, TypeScript is saying cannot assign to first name, that's the variable's name, because it is a constant. So with let variables, we can reassign freely, but with const variables, we cannot. And to show what happens when we run this code, we'll run it and we get an error. And we actually have the same error that we were seeing inside of VS Code when we hovered over where it has the red squiggles. So I'm going to leave this code here, but I don't want it to break my application and prevent it from running. So I'm going to do Control// that will comment out my line. And then I'll add another comment above it that says cannot reassign to const. So what a comment is it's basically a note that you can put in your code, which doesn't actually run. So when our program hits this line of execution, these lines are effectively just ignored, and it's just a way to leave notes to the future developers. Another way you can do a multi-line comment would be /**, hit enter, and this will create a multi-line comment where you can add additional notes. Something that we might want to note is by default, you should always use const. And then if you determine that you need to be reassigning that variable in code, you can switch over to let. If you're new to programming, it might not make sense why one is better than the other, but if you default to using const, it can potentially save you some issues in the long run. Now there is one more way to create a variable, and that's going to be using the var keyword. So for the var variable, I'm going to say var, don't use var as the variable name, and we'll assign it the value, never use var. The var keyword has some abnormal behaviors. I'll get into those abnormal behaviors in future lessons, but for now just know that you should never use var, but it's likely that you're going to see code on the internet which does use var. It's an older standard, it shouldn't be used. There's really just never a good reason to use var. Just to show that it does work, I'll console log var, run my application. It does print the value stored, which is never use var. And that concludes our initial lesson on variables.